Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to researchED Home, and this afternoon we have Ben White with us. It looks like a very, very interesting, intriguing presentation, and I've been privy to some of the artwork, so you've got something in store for you. Ben is a research lead in his school. He is also co-organizer of researchED Kent. So he knows a thing or two about organising one of our events. And Ben has collaborated with a lot of people. He works with a lot of people outside of his own school and with different organisations like CB. So if you want to know anything about evidence-informed practice, talking to him is a very good bet. So Ben, if you're ready.
I am.
Yes. So without further ado, here's Ben White.
Okay, fantastic. So welcome to You Should Know This, which is the first talk I've given from my garage and in slippers and using my own sketches. So to kick things off, I'm going to share with you my screen and then we can begin. I really hate it when teachers say things like, "You should know this," or "This is year 7 work," or "This was in your Key Stage 3 textbook. You really should have learned this." It makes me feel even more pathetic than I already am. Thanks. That came from a year 9 student. Don't worry, it gets more positive. So a student in year 9 wrote this in response to the question, what would it be helpful for your teachers to understand about your experiences in their lessons? And I was surprised to find this exact phrase popped up unasked for or primed in several responses. So I explored it a bit more in several student focus groups. What is this "you should know this" moment? First in my own school and then subsequently in other secondary schools. So the majority of students who we spoke to reported it does happen, and it tends to pan out like this. A teacher, there's me there, finds out that some students don't know what they should for the planned session to work. And this leads them to tell the class, "You should know this," or words to that effect, perhaps reminding teachers or students of when they learnt it or the book in which the information is. And then quite often, the teacher proceeds to teach the class as if they did know this, despite having just established that some of the students didn't. Now, interestingly, when I tell teachers about this, well, quite often they'll pause for a moment and respond by saying, "Yeah, I do say that, but that's not what I mean." This is an interesting kind of event that happens to many of us teachers. At first, I saw here an obvious and fixable curriculum moment that could be fixed by curriculum sequencing. If only teachers could use retrieval practice and a curriculum which revisits material, then this problem need not exist. We're going to come back to this guy later. This is the shining pedagogical knight version of me. But on reflection and some really helpful prompting from others with different perspectives and expertise, I now see that "you should know this" moment is rather more complex. And again, we'll come back to that concept of complexity a bit later. In order to sort of break this down, we'll need to look at each aspect of the "you should know this" moment. And we're quite interested, or I'm quite interested, apologies, in the extent to which it shows us quite a bit about the act of teaching itself. So what do we learn from this "you should know this" moment? I think that untangling why they occur can help make sense of the frustrations that they often induce within teachers, because at their core lie the challenges that are built into us teachers' tasks of producing particular learning in a group of students simultaneously, and the extra complexity that we, and I include teachers in that, but also leaders and policymakers, have a want to introduce, often because we overreach or ignore the complexity itself. Okay, so this is what we're going to focus upon in the talk today. We're going to look at each element of that phrase, "you should and know this." There's actually quite a lot there. Let's look first of all at the concept of knowing this. Now, the act of learning, as I'm sure we're all very aware, is complicated. Gert by Esther points out that we only really know if someone's learned something after the event. researchED has become a place we can go to glean insights from cognitive psychology about the learning process, and they can be hugely helpful. There's a fantastic talk by Willingham in 2017 where he introduces this concept of using established research and the models they inform in cognitive psychology to help kind of structure and refine what we're doing as teachers. But quite a lot of a discussion around how to use psychology or cognitive psychology to inform teaching practice overlooks the additional challenge that we teachers have, which is, of course, we're not just teaching one student, we're teaching multiple students, far more than 6, although maybe this is timely drawing given the way that school may be working over the future weeks and months. So we're trying to induce learning in a number of students at speed. And of course, we all know, we don't actually know whether they know this or not. So teaching involves an element of mind reading. Now we can get quite good at this. Paul Ekman and his life's work has really been studying individual facial expressions. He often calls them micro expressions, those points when a student or another person gives away what they're thinking with an expression that passes briefly across their face. And if you've been teaching remotely like myself in recent months, you may have noticed quite how much you miss seeing those, engaging with that, using that as a kind of cue for what to say and what to do next. But even if I can get it right, so if I can work out what students do and don't know within the class, the fact that they're all there mean I can't necessarily do the best thing for each of them next. And we often now look critically at the idea of differentiating, maybe planning a lesson for each 6 of these students before the lesson starts, because we know that's unfeasible, although it would be nice to teach in a way where they all made progress based upon where they began and successfully learning new ideas over the course of the hour. But we're slower to see the challenges wrapped into other solutions that become popular. So for example, the concept of responsive teaching, which is a fantastic idea and can improve what we're doing. But if I can't differentiate before a lesson, the idea that I can do that successfully on the fly is challenging. So here we start to see the problems which ensue when a sensible observation is important to glean from students what they do and don't know to inform what we do next, becomes the latest kind of mandatory means by which the problems like the "you should know this" moment can be avoided or eliminated within teachings. So even if the class were a single entity who I could read the minds of really very clearly, I face quite a complex problem. But of course, the "you" in the "you should know this" doesn't really exist, because the classroom is a complex system. Now, complex systems are often compared to intractable knots. You can often see the strands that make them up, but we're not totally sure how they interact. Pulling too hard on one thread may have unexpected effects. And no single thread makes complete sense of that context. Now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, because he often gets cited and quoted on Edu's Twitter and elsewhere, Graham Nuttall is fantastic for producing insights into classroom complexity. So his book, The Hidden Lives of Learners, punctured any ideas I used to have that my class is a tightly run ship, crewed with students with near perfect recall and the capacity to unerringly interpret and enact my instructions as I intend them. His observations make it very clear that differences between students mean they start lessons in unique positions with unique motivations, and this creates different experiences and therefore different learning for each of them. It's not good or bad, it just is. Firstly, he found that many students already do sort of know this. In some of his research, he created finely grained assessments, which identified what students knew before they were taught a new module in geography, science, and he found that on average they knew 50% of what they're about to be taught. Now, of course, this varied between students. Not all students knew 50%, and even those who knew that percentage all knew different 50%, if you see what I mean. But this is something we teachers and others pick up on quite regularly, the idea there's a knowledge gap. The vocabulary gap, for example, is a kind of knowledge gap. And this concept of cultural capital, or at least as it's been used in the latest Ofsted framework, kind of picks up on the problems that ensue when students know different things because of different life experiences. I've got a short illustration of that here. recently I've been reading Biff, Chip and Kipper, quite highbrow, I realise, to my daughter. We're reading this story. Gran, that's Gran, not the Queen, as it happens in the picture, is heading off to see the Queen, and she buys some new shoes. The heel comes off her new shoes. Chip gets quite upset, but he's picked up on what's happened, which is great. Then an older gentleman drives up. This is kind of pre last few years, I imagine, at the gate. And we find out he's called the Duke, and he says, wait here, I'll see what I can do. A few moments later, another person emerges from the palace with a suitcase full of shoes and says, you can choose from these. Okay, I want to spoil the ending of the story. But the next question that we're asked is, what did the Queen do to help Gran? Now, in order for me to understand what's going on there, I need to know who the Duke is, that he's married to the Queen. I need to know that the Queen and the Duke have servants. And if I don't know that, then those last 10 minutes, as weird as they were for those of you that do know it, are going to be even more mystifying. So we know that there will be differences in the classroom experience based upon different knowledge. This is something Michael Merrick on Twitter picks up as a noun gap. He says a lot of the vocab gap that he comes across in primary school is a knowledge of things in the world. So knowledge of nouns. That means that same experience, a conversation, a discussion, a short explanation from a teacher, a new idea can easily become lost because of these differences in knowledge. And for other students, they already know it, and before the course or the unit is taught. So that's one strand of his classroom complexity. But of course, there's quite a lot more going on. We also have the social dynamic, and this is something, again, that Nuttall was fantastic at picking up on, because he attached microphones to the different students, or 6 or 7 in a class over the course of several lessons, to really pick up on what they were saying and what they were doing. And I don't want to shock you, but he found that quite often the things they were doing and saying had nothing. That's meant to be a heart, it's terrible. They had nothing to do with what the teacher was talking about or thinking or saying. So for example, in one conversation, he found the teacher puts on a video. 2 girls at the back turn to each other and say, right, Olivia, if you dump Zach, maybe you could go out with Brian, and then Zach can go out with Emerald, and then the video stops, the teacher asks for their attention, and they carry on. It's happening all the time, to different degrees in different classroom contexts, I would imagine. But it's not just about behaving that the social dynamic comes into play. There's rules and a hierarchy in the classroom that can make it a very stressful place to be, and perhaps which are influencing our students' decisions to share video or audio if we're offering video lessons. There's one conversation, and I picture the boy looking a bit like this, which Nuttall's microphones picked up, where a boy doesn't know how to spell the word Antarctica. So he musters up the courage to ask the girl next to him. Maybe it's this girl, who's currently trying to avoid the advances of the boy to her left. And she says, how do you spell Antarctica? And she turns and she says, you're an idiot. I think she uses ruder language than that, actually, and points out all the different times and places they've written Antarctica before, then goes back to work. The social hierarchy of the classroom is a big deal. Becky Francis, who currently heads up the EEF, in earlier research, early in her career, looked at the inhibitions and behaviours of high ability students in secondary schools. And one of the findings particularly sticks with me, and that was the anxiety that students feel if they answer too many questions correctly. So she picked up on, in the 1990s, a girl, if you answered too many answers correctly, risked becoming framed by the rest of the class as, I think her language was, an asexualized Pippi Longstocking character, a dowdy character that no one wanted to be with, so you didn't want to do that. At the same time, if a boy answered too many questions correctly, then they would be labelled as gay, and they didn't want that. Now, hopefully the rules of the classroom have moved on since the 1990s, but I often think about those when I'm looking out at a class and I'm thinking they're just not engaging or they're going quiet. What rules are they playing? What hierarchy is at play in that room? And then, of course, alongside social dynamic and differences in background knowledge, we have this variation in ability. Now, this is controversial in schools, and intelligence research is nuanced, but it has troubling historical and cultural baggage and is often very badly applied. However, the idea that different individuals have different capacities to respond to the same challenges seems to be well supported by psychological research. There's a fantastic series which looks at a number of the issues and topics around intelligence by a group called Radiolab that work in in the US. And in this series, Siddhartha Mukherjee, who's a medical doctor and the author of The Gene, An Intimate History, is asked, what is intelligence? How do you actually define this thing that you spent a lot of your time talking about and studying? And he suggests that it's an individual's capacity to navigate problem space. His claim or assertion is that some people are more adept and sure-footed at navigating problem space than others, at manipulating their way across this space, this metaphorical space in which problems kind of lurk. As a teacher, I know that some students do seem to consistently learn more and pick up ideas quicker within an hour's teaching than others. So one I'm thinking of in particular, over the past year, consistently knows the question I'm going to ask next. Like he's already there, maybe because he knows a lot of it already. He can predict the thing I'm about to ask, and other students can't reframe or answer the question I'm asking now. So it seems to me as a teacher that students do have differing capacities to navigate problem space. What I don't know as a teacher, and where I have to be very careful, is the extent to which this is an innate ability thing, that is heritable, that's genetic, or the extent to which is environmental, or the extent to which I've just got it wrong, which is very common. And so I can't make strong conclusions about that, but I can say that my experience as a teacher shows that students learn ideas at different paces. And that therefore changes their experience of a lesson and explains why some know things later when others don't. Another strand of this complexity that's kind of constantly at play within just a small classroom space is to do with motivation. And by this, I don't mean motivation to learn or attitude to learning in some of the hackneyed ways it gets applied, but motivation as an urge or prompt to act. So we know from psychology that the same stimulus can affect different people differently. It gives us a different degree of urge or prompt to act or behave in a particular way. And there's reasonably strong support for the big 5 personality traits in psychology. You might see them called ocean or canoe: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And each of these, to some extent, predict the ways in which individuals respond to the same stimulus. So extroverts, for example, are relatively under-aroused by the same activities or events which stimulate quite highly others, perhaps explaining the appeal of high-octane risk-taking behaviours to some and the joy of Sudoku to others. But back to the classroom, here we can see a student, I think, expressing one of these differences. Following reading Graham Nuttall's book, I picked a few of the extracts I found particularly interesting or pertinent and shared them with a couple of our Year 9 study focus groups and just said, does this happen to you? Does this reflect your experience? And teachers listening will know when you set a task or ask a question that just works, this class goes silent and starts working. It's one of those moments, like a high proportion of students wrote quietly for a long time, keen to share how Nuttall's ideas resonated with their own experiences. I've not found that with any other research that I've shared with them. So this student, talks about a video lesson. There's a lot going on here, but I'm particularly interested in the fact that she almost fell asleep because the lesson was so boring. Oh goodness, the person behind had to nudge me to keep me awake. However, this is the complete opposite to some people, as they came out of the lesson buzzing. And the girl who nudged me said the lesson was pretty interesting and began chatting to me about it. I could hardly respond because throughout the lesson I had difficulty keeping my eyes open. There was nothing for my brain to do. So it just switched off. Different students will have different motivations and will find different aspects of our teaching stimulate them in different ways. This is quite a big deal. This girl, there's nothing for her brain to do, so it went to sleep. That's going to happen sometimes. And then lastly, of course, we've got all the individual differences, because all of these other kind of variables relate to things we can measure at group level to some extent. Social dynamic, differences in ability, differences in prior knowledge, and then differences in terms of individual motivations or individual characteristics or traits. Then we've got individual differences, and these are the things that just make people who they are. Some of them are tragic in terms of shaping the life experience of students, and certainly one of the consequences of these tragic events or incidents is that they change the experience of the classroom for a student. So for example, a couple of years ago, I worked with a school where teachers were complaining about a boy who was dozing in lessons, was not engaging, was quite rude and slow to respond to them. On closer investigation, speaking with him, the senior leaders found he'd been walking 15 miles into school each day because his mum and him had moved away from an abusive partner. And so that was one of the reasons he turned up tired and less than engaged with the lesson. Some individual differences are random but predictable. If you've taught for a few years, you know some days, and particularly sixth form students, you know some days students will be upset because a romantic relationship has just ended. Or you know some days some students seem to be affected by prior events or an incident in an earlier lesson. Some students daydream for a while or get particularly hooked with an idea. And those things also affect an individual's experience of a lesson. And then some of these incidences defy categorization. They're just bizarre things that make that student's experience of the lesson different. And last week I was teaching an online lesson and I was interrupted partway through by a girl who said, "I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to turn my sound off because of the lamb." I said, "You what now?" I assumed she meant lag, didn't really understand technology, but in fact, she had a lamb on her lap. Her parents were farmers. I don't understand farming fully myself, but I think the ewe had 3 lambs and you can't leave 3 with the ewe, so she was bringing up this lamb, so she had a lamb on her lap. And I feel like that's a nice metaphor for the different things we just can't grasp or get our heads around when we look at our class. What is it that is distracting them or taking their attention or making them think about something completely different? So each of these strands are significant and they contribute to the complexity of the classroom, and understanding them can perhaps improve the quality of our teaching. And expert teachers' capacity to read and respond to the room is probably partly explained by their tacit knowledge of this complexity and how to interact with it. But we don't really know how these different variables interact, and no single strand gives a complete picture of what's going on. And the more I look into them, the less I think a single hour's teaching can resolve them, because they continue throughout the hour of my lesson. So we're faced with what Professor Becky Allen sometimes refers to as the Simpsons problem. We've only got so much time, and different students are going to learn at different rates within our lessons. And that's probably one of the reasons we end up thinking, "Oh, you should know this," maybe getting frustrated. But there's more going on when we focus specifically upon the should, the idea that students need to learn certain things at certain times. We think this as teachers because it's built in to the system. So moving away from the Simpsons to a professor of psychology, we have Seymour Saracen, who points this out. Just in case some of you are just listening and not watching. A graded school system taking a crop of children every year at 5 to 6 years of age and moving them through their studies in a lockstep fashion till graduation makes an assumption about the equality of motivation and performance for children of similar age that the reality of individual differences rudely challenges. In the UK, we tend to take a group of students who are all of the same biological age, give or take, say 12 months, and we set them up on a course with a fixed period of lessons that lasts generally for a year. And those students should, according to our plans, move through the course at a fairly consistent speed or rate. And that's where the "you should know this" moment can become quite frustrating. So say I get to there, I'm teaching AQA psychology, and we're exploring issues and debates. Say, in order to talk about this, we need to draw on concepts like attachment, issues around the validity and reliability of data. And if it becomes clear to me that some students or one student doesn't know this, well, they should. Not just because it's integral to the course, but because I've only got 5 weeks left to finish teaching the course. So sometimes I have to make a compromise and move on, even though some of those students don't understand it. And that does seem to be kind of built in. Now, this isn't an argument against the system. because complex systems aren't good or bad. They are a thing that exists within the social world. And we always have to balance out individual needs against what's going to help the majority. But it's just worth pointing out that the system has been different at different times and is in different places. So for example, the one-room schoolhouse, students would use primers, which they tended to work through in relation to whether or not they'd completed the previous task, rather than being driven primarily by how old they were. Or in some contexts, and this seems to vary in whether it's applied or not, students might repeat a grade if they get to the end of that particular conveyor belt and they're not where we feel they should be. Perhaps it'll be repeated. So we've got complexity that comes from working with a group of individual agents or people within a classroom and all the differences that make them individuals. Then we've got complexity further built in by the system itself, by the restraints, the time, the resources, and the length of course that I'm working with. But there are other dynamics that produce this idea that students should know things as well. And that's, again, because we're looking at a complex problem. So complex problems frustrate us, and solutions to them, or responses that promise to resolve the problem, can be quite alluring. And this is something that Becky Allen and I explored in an earlier researchED talk, I think just towards the end of last year, where we look at waves within the educational system. The idea that a new policy initiative, a new solution rises with the promise of changing things, tends to crash, recedes, then is replaced by the next one. Kind of interested in why those things happen. Why is it, I'm sorry, the quality of pictures declines, if they were any good even to start with, that we end up with these solutions that for a while become quite popular? APP, data sheets for classes, PELTS, SEAL, curriculum maps. These are all things that are proposed as a way of resolving that underlying difficulty or challenges of classroom teaching. Why does this happen? Well, we think it happens in part because they are quite a sensible idea, an insight into the complex classroom environment that might support improved teaching. And that's fantastic. But in order for that idea to kind of spread around an educational system, it needs to be defined only very loosely, so different people can interpret that in ways that make sense to their context. Because classrooms are complex environments, it's quite hard to know whether this new thing that we've been asked to do is actually working or not, because schools and classrooms that seem to be doing well will often say, we're doing this thing, we're carefully forensically tracking data, say a recent curriculum wave. And then schools that are not doing well, the assumption can often be, well, by definition, you must not be doing it properly. So one of the reasons these waves emerge is because it's people's job to resolve the difficulties that education seems to face. And so therefore it's their job to produce these solutions. And because we're working in, but often overlook, the complexity of the educational environment, it's quite hard to tell for quite a long time whether these things are actually working or not. So there's a lot of external pressures on those of us in schools to introduce and enact solutions that are never fully worked out. But it's not just external forces that make me want to ignore complexity and introduce solutions that will make the problems that I regularly face just go away. It's me again, isn't it? I don't know if you can recognize that there or not, but this is the shining pedagogical light version of myself. And I got into education to make a difference to the world and to improve things that I think are not great. And therefore, it can be quite alluring to think that what I can do can have a huge impact, can close attainment gaps, can reduce inequality. And we don't want to lose that from the system. We want people to come into education who want to change and improve it. But quite often, wider systemic pressures to produce solutions, coupled with individuals working in the system who want to achieve the same, can produce a dynamic that's unhelpful for teachers, which we'll get to in a second, because we overlook or ignore the complexity of the classroom itself. School improvement, of course, is a bit of a tightrope, because obviously we want to aspire to improve, but we don't want to feel compelled to function as if complexity didn't exist. Sometimes it can feel like I'm being asked to perform a miracle in the classroom. So not only is the classroom a complex place to start with, but I feel like I'm asked to do something that isn't fully worked out. There's no clear set of rules or explanations that show me how to do this thing. It makes sense to look at previous examples of mandatory miracles in the system. So one of my earlier collaborative projects, I worked with NCTL and the DFE looking at data use and workload within schools. And one of the responses or insights we had shared from a teacher was this, who said, I could be supporting teaching and learning, but instead I'm not looking at what makes teachers better, but I'm trying to draw a graph to prove that we're a good school. So this teacher, 4 years ago now, felt that the thing she was being asked to do was to create evidence of a miracle, to draw a graph that proved the school was good. The same comes from classroom teachers as well. So this is from a transcript interview with a secondary school teacher 3 years ago. Sometimes I find that I'm doing things with data rather than necessarily marking and planning, and I think, why? Why? Because the marking and planning have far more of an impact on the children. And I'm doing this because someone tells me I have to do this, because I have to prove that what I'm doing, rather than just being able to get on with what I'm doing, if you see what I mean. So ignoring complexity kind of means that the system, the schools, are often slower to react when solutions fail to work, and we often end up making an impossible job quite a bit harder. Some of our training, I think, in recent years, has contributed to the problem rather than resolving it. The NPQSL, which I took, and they have changed recently, I think fueled the sort of thinking that denies or ignores complexity. My job was to identify a group within a school who are underperforming, to use my individual charismatic leadership to transform the gap that group kind of indicated, and then to evidence it. I was meant to use my project to evidence the progress or impact that I've had. I think this sort of oversimplification exaggerates what we as teachers can know and also predictably do in a school, and probably fuels extra complexity at a greater rate in the context that least need it. So those sorts of approaches are more common where things seem to be going badly. But the main focus of the talk today is really about the classroom and why it's a complex environment. And I think the classroom environment is largely shaped by the way that the teacher thinks about and feels around their kind of job. So back to this concept of miracles. If I am working in a classroom where I feel I've been asked to do something that is not feasible, there's no rational set of rules explaining how to do this thing, how might I respond if I'm asked to use data to prove something, to demonstrate that all students have made progress, to ensure that there's a buzz in the room, to ensure that the books all show X, or to ensure that all students kind of follow a curriculum map? The clue in those mandates is if they kind of ignore or sidestep complexity, they've probably gone too far. How might I respond? I might respond cynically, just say it, there you go. There's the map, there's the progress graph, here's my group information sheet, and just present the thing that I think I'm asked to do. And that's a shame that teachers are spending time doing things like that. But there's other responses as well. And I often find on Facebook teacher community groups, this is a very common mindset on which teachers find themselves. And I think it's driven by the assumption that people higher up must know more or understand the system more clearly than I do. So we can be confused. How do you do that? How do you differentiate properly, consistently? How do you ensure that all students make progress? How do you ensure that your books demonstrate X? Teachers spend a lot of time asking questions about how to enact particular miracles, I think, giving sometimes too much credence to the policymakers or the school leaders who introduce a policy without fully working out what that looks like on the ground. This confusion can sometimes flick into intensity. So one of the reasons my Twitter handle is Walden Kent is because I love David Henry Thoreau's book of the same name, in which he famously writes that most men, by which I'm sure he does mean people, it's a long time back, live lives of quiet desperation. Now, I don't know if this applies to all people, but I know a lot of teachers who spend a significant proportion of time feeling quietly desperate, trying to make things work when we're not sure whether they are or they are not. And so we can vacillate between confusion and desperation if we assume the thing that we've been asked to do is achievable or doable. Less well known is Thoreau's next line, which is that other men live lives of resignation, which is just confirmed desperation. This guy's resigned to things not working. And that could be, in teaching, that could be literal resignation, couldn't it? We know that we don't keep teachers as long as we'd like to, but also it can be a mindset within the classroom, resigned to things not changing or improving. And I think some of those responses, in part, are driven by mandated behaviour changes in the classroom that haven't properly engaged with complexity. But this is quite a well-worn argument, important nonetheless. I think there's something else that can happen if you get this far. If you say, wait, I can see this. I can see that that data nonsense was producing lots of unhelpful work in many contexts, and therefore it needs to kind of be removed. But it's easier to see the problem with an earlier mandated miracle than it is to see the limitations of my own solution. And Munro, who Matthew Evans is particularly big on kind of sharing his complexity-based insights with in relation to schools, talks about how sometimes if we look at a problem in a very narrow sense, in this case, problems within the classroom, we might diagnose the problem at the level at which we're looking at it and just create a new patch to resolve that problem. I could, in theory, have looked at data nonsense and said, yeah, this is not quite working. What we need to do next is X. And I have to be careful that the patch that I'm suggesting doesn't promise more than it can achieve. So for example, if we go back to that, my earlier reaction to the you should know this moment, if I really start to think that if people just knew what I knew, then it could be resolved, there can be problems. So maybe my lack of understanding of the deep structure of the classroom, my shining knight syndrome, something called sunk cost fallacy, where things I spend time on and invest in seem more important to me than perhaps they should be, that can start to backfire if I start ignoring complexity. So in the short term, if I decided, no, these you should know this moments, they're really a kind of a curriculum failure and a failure to engage with cognitive psychology, I'm going to be headed for a fall, and I'm going to have limited efficacy when I'm engaging with other people. Because what does it do to me when I realise my students don't remember what I last taught them? I'm going to get frustrated with them. How does this affect the way I engage with other teachers? If I think I know how to do it properly, you just need to know what I know. That's a problem. And also it might affect the way I explain the knowledge gaps I pick up in students' ideas. I might think that if teachers had taught them properly, then they would know this. And also it changes the way I interact with students. And we'll come back to this in a moment. If I've decided I know why students don't know this, then I'm less interested in finding out anything more from them because I've got it kind of fixed in my head. So what unites both this external pressure to follow along with the latest wave and the internal dynamic to kind of achieve and change and make a dent on the universe is that they sometimes produce this pressure to deny or ignore complexity. And if that happens, then the teachers who work for and with us are lumbered not only with tackling the inevitable you should know this moment, but dealing with what they imply about the adequacy of their own teaching or their students' efforts or previous teachers, etc. That's a problem. Because I think we're better placed to see the you should know this moment as the crux of teaching, not an impediment to it. And this has practical and I'd say existential benefits. So you should know this moments will happen, but I should sort of expect them. That's part of the job. And teachers watching this hopefully recognize that it can be fun. Deciding what to do next in the moment is exciting. Reflecting on what can I do differently in the future, kind of helpful. I think of teaching sometimes as like improvised jazz. I spend my time learning scales, thinking carefully in the classroom. Sometimes you have to kind of change the tune that you're playing. You get better by working on those core kind of principles and scales. And I think this is what I miss most with school closure at the moment, those moments of thinking, goodness, you seem to have forgotten everything that we talked about and you seem to know less than 2 days ago. That's part of the fun of teaching. Some writers pick up on this, in my view, really nicely and very, very well, very clearly. Mary Kennedy, for example, talks about teaching being a human improvement profession. So starting or leading with the idea that my success depends upon the clients as well and all the different variables that affect their lives, the students. And that compromise is going to be needed. but there will be fairly predictable problems that teachers can start to focus on, responding to and tackling, because they come up regularly when we're working with groups of people, moving them through a course using finite resources in a fixed time period. We're going to face the challenge of portraying the curriculum. What's the clearest way I can get this across? Can I make that clearer? Always the answer is yes, isn't it? You can always portray the curriculum in a clearer and maybe more concise, more compelling way. That's a persistent problem that teachers face, and not one that you do. You don't finish it. You constantly can reflect upon it. We have to enlist participation, another huge challenge with online learning. How is it that I get the students to do the things that I think are going to help them to learn? What are the different moves, the set pieces, the engagement, the facial expressions? That's part of teaching. Then we've got mind reading. We need to expose thinking. In order for me to do this better, I need to identify what it is you think now. How do I get an insight into the minds of 30 students at once? It's a challenge that we're going to constantly face. And of course, we need to contain behaviour. And in Kennedy's piece on these persistent problems, what she picks up on is that compromise is built in. Perhaps, in my view, because once we acknowledge the classroom is a complex context, you can't fix it. You just engage with it. And everything you do will resolve some issues, but may produce others later down the line. There's going to be compromise built in. For example, with behaviour, she points out that in most of the classes she went to see, there were some students from whom the teacher accepted not disrupting the class as success, so they could continue to teach the others. But I think, for me, the same applies to the academic side of the classroom as well. When I started my career, I like dancing between ideas. I like discussing big questions, moving quickly, critiquing arguments and the like. And I think my classroom did that. So it seemed to work really well for the students who could navigate idea space nimbly, shall we say. But other students would get lost quite quickly. I've made a compromise. Because I'm not aware of the complexity of the classroom, I'm not even aware that I've done it. More recently, I found that some students will say that stopping and reviewing key ideas at the start of a lesson is a bit boring or seems unnecessary. I've made a different compromise. I've decided for the majority of students, it actually helps to be very systematic and to start each lesson with a review. That's not perfect. I'm happy with the feedback from one or two saying it's a little dull, because I'd rather that than a number of students feel lost. But there's compromise built into teaching. Understanding that stops me panicking when I hear those kind of critique and comments, allows me to think and reflect, what can I do for those other students, therefore, to make that classroom experience better? So I think understanding complexity can help us to view the job in a more nuanced and helpful way, and to focus upon the persistent problems that we're likely to face. But as I said, I think it also has kind of existential benefit as well. So we'll start with workload. Again, with the workload research that I was involved in a couple of years back now, we looked into the measure of burnout, which is an operationalization, a way of measuring the extent to which a job is sustainable over time. And we find that one key measure built into this concept of burnout is depersonalisation. You're likely to be burnt out if and when people start to look like an impediment to you doing your job. It's probably the worst picture of the set. Here we've got that class, that complexity getting in the way of me succeeding. If I accept a naive model or mandatory action to carry out within a classroom that ignores complexity, then I think it's quite rather more likely that I'm going to start to drift down that road of depersonalisation. Students start to get in the way. Those you should know this moments become a barrier to me getting my job done, rather than being the job itself. But why else might it be helpful to countenance complexity? Well, I think it can allow us to be critical without being cynical, and that's a very hard balance to get. But a more nuanced educational discourse can allow me to ask questions about the thing that I'm being asked to do without denying the aim that they're kind of directed towards. One of the ways I think of this is that sometimes I think desirable outputs in a classroom get confused with inputs. So it would be nice if this could happen. It would be nice if all students could learn a lot. It would be nice if these gaps could close, but often that output becomes the mandated behaviour. But it's unclear what needs to be done to produce them. So grades, progress targets, gaps disappearing, they're all outputs. And then some of the actions that I then carry out in order to make those things happen are actually just wishful thinking or worry masquerading as action. So where I might have said that I was focusing upon students or targeting them or uplifting them or boosting them or gap closing, that's quite a lot of mental work, but it doesn't, in my view, have a lot to do with those persistent problems and the behaviours that I might carry out as a teacher to kind of engage with them. So we can be sceptical about things that we've been asked to do. And the other kind of lesson that I'm learning, the more I look at complexity, is the need to accept that it affects all of us. So the idea that I can come in, discern the problem with education and show us what we need to do to fix it, I need to be very sceptical about that as well. The closer I look at my own classroom, the more I'm aware that students don't all learn. Students are sometimes bored, and they'll quite often forget the things that I'm teaching them now that I think of as vital. So engaging with complexity tells me that's just part of the job. It's not necessarily an individual failing. And then lastly, for me, engaging with the complexity of the classroom or thinking about it a little more allows me a calmer perspective upon what goes on. So we do need to do simple things in schools. It needs to boil down to particular behaviours and actions. But I think there's two sorts of simplicity. There's simplicity that denies the complexity of the classroom, and there's simplicity that accepts and works with it. And that's what I'd like to think that we're working towards. My favourite Supreme Court judge, the only one I can name actually, once wrote, so Oliver Wendell Holmes once wrote, the only simplicity for which I would give a straw is that which is on the other side of complexity, not that which has never divined it. So I'm hoping over the course of the last 40 minutes or so, we've had a little window into classroom complexity, which is not often thought about or shared, and beginning to kind of point out how it's helpful to engage with it and what an understanding of complexity might do to the way that we approach our classes and perhaps the way that we manage the teachers who work with the classes in our schools. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Can I ask you first of all, it's not content related, but someone's just asked, so I thought I might ask.
Yeah.
They were just interested in the platform that you use, the software that you use, because people enjoyed the way that you presented the information today.
That's good. Well, I've used Notability, which is a paid for app on the iPad. I think it costs £5 or £10. You can get a school license, and then I've got an iPad with an Apple Pencil. And you're happy to kind of talk through how that works. If someone wants to kind of tweet or message me afterwards, that would be fine.
I'm sure we can do that after.
No problem.
Okay, so that was really, really interesting. I mean, you covered an awful lot of ground here. And someone was wondering about relationships as well. Isn't that another level of complexity in the classroom?
Yes.
Perhaps you touched on that a little bit, but the relationship is ultimately very complex.
Rob Lowe, who I think he's spoken at a researchED event in the past, is really good at exploring this concept of relational proximity or closeness. And there's a diagnostic that his organisation's been working on that identifies how close a student feels towards their teacher. I find that's a fascinating dynamic as well. And he talks of the need for students to feel, it's not about being friends with a teacher, but feeling close to them, feeling that they're viewed as a person. And that's actually a variable that you can start to measure, and you can see it affecting the way they interact with the class. And that's huge, of course. Yeah, there's, I mean, probably of the 4 or 5 things we looked at, there are tens of others that you could spend longer exploring as well. But I recommend, I think it's the Relational Schools Foundation. And Rob Lowe looks particularly at relationships and how they affect the learning environment. It's definitely worth looking into.
Yeah, absolutely. You just reminded me of that, actually. You talked a lot about data and perhaps the unnecessary data that we tend to collect, perhaps to make us feel better or to make us feel like we're doing something.
Yeah.
What kind of data do you think is useful or worth gathering?
I think the school closure has been interesting for that, because it's made me, because I think I worked, like many of us, worked for a time when schools were producing lots of data that wasn't particularly helpful. I kind of backed off it to quite a large degree. But in engaging with students remotely, data like noticing whether they've logged in or not, or answered questions, or have completed work within the last 2 or 3 days, over time builds up quite a useful picture. So sort of the data that I'm capturing with my psychology classes at the minute is not primarily grade-based data, because I don't think it's a valid measure of what they're doing away from the school environment. But it's to do with whether or not they're engaging with the video lesson, with the content, whether they're completing tasks. And we've got, again, using Google Classroom, I've got individual kind of conversation strands with each student. And that, I think that sort of data is useful. And more than before, I see the point of me once a week looking at that big picture and sending a list of students about whom I'm particularly concerned to the leaders of the sixth form, because then they can see, well, is that happening in just this subject or 2 or 3 others? That data seems particularly important.
Yeah, I've found exactly the same, so where do you stand on tracking then? Is it worth doing? I mean, you can't imagine going to a school and saying, look, we've got to stop tracking, because that will be advocated in some way or other.
I think
what would you do?
Sort of monitoring how students are doing seems important. What tends to happen, or it seems to happen in my view, when we become obsessed with one particular strand or aspect of the classroom, so the data that we've got on assessment would be an example of that, is that we expect that to be able to do far more than it really can. So the idea that we can actually identify where a student should or shouldn't be in terms of the other students in the class because of how they have done in the past. I'm going to stop that. There we go. Seems a little naive. So I don't think that we can track in that way, but it might force us to look at what we can track. And it's probably when schools begin again, what does the leader of sixth form need to know about students in my psychology class? They probably do need to know whether or not they're engaging with the lessons, whether they need further help, whether they seem to be coming in, whether they're speaking in lessons, whether they seem upset. That sort of data seems quite important. And some of the other data, I think it just produces work that isn't really work. So if you take students who are borderline A, B, say, in a cohort, apart from speaking with the psychology teacher who can help explain ideas to them more clearly, what can someone else actually do? Well, they might be able to check whether those students have access to work context at home, or check whether they're completing homework, or check whether they're attending. But if that's the case, you're better looking at those ideas, I think, than kind of some of the more, I think, spurious uses of assessment data. But I could talk about data for a whole talk. I'm aware I don't want to keep going on about that.
No, okay, understood. But perhaps it's another type of data here, but isn't there a tension between trying to find out a lot of information about students in order to better understand perhaps their reactions in the classroom, and the idea that sometimes when we know things about the child's background, that might limit our expectations in the classroom?
Yeah, and I think that's the difficult dance that we have. There was a Twitter debate this week where someone, I think, pointed out that school closures show that the problems we face in different contexts are totally different, and reforming curriculum won't fix educational outcomes in particular schools. And that's kind of true. There's a huge amount of things going on that curriculum won't resolve. But then the response was, but you don't want to discourage people from trying to improve things they can. And I think there's a difficult dance, isn't there, that goes on that says, well, yes, no single thing can fix things, but secondly, we have to do what we can. And I think it kind of comes into that concept of student ability. I think it's pretty well supported that different students will have different ability to understand or learn from an hour of my teaching. That's just the way it is. I can't control that at all. And nor should I go beyond that and say, I think I know who's going to learn or not here. Just have to do the best job that I can. And I think it's an open question whether or not thinking about complexity allows us to have a more nuanced approach or discourages us from doing simple things really well. And it's something to be aware of, I would say.
Well, you've just talked about ability. So there was one question that came in. Where do you fall in terms of setting versus mixed ability based on the talk that you've just given us? And someone is particularly interested in finding out about what you think of that in the context of history.
I think that the devil's often in the detail. So quite often in a school, ability setting won't be driven by aptitude within history, but something a bit wider. And therefore those kind of sets or groups are going to be kind of arbitrary. I think it's not necessarily well, it could sometimes be a helpful thing to do. I think it's putting students into groups that kind of match broadly what they're able to access or consider within a lesson. But the bit that I find difficult and haven't managed to resolve in my own head is that's kind of true in general, but there'll always be individuals who miss out with that. And you can see that in maths. So when we looked at grade predictions, maths teachers would say, we're really accurate at predicting grades within maths. But that seems to partly be driven by the fact that certain classes were only taught ideas that would get them to a particular threshold. So they're sort of capped by that setting system. And that seems to be, I guess it's back to Seymour Saracen and the lockstep process system that we have. In order to take a group of students through school year on year, we have to put them in a group that lasts for a year with a teacher engaging with them once or twice a week for each of the weeks of term. And that's not ideal for individuals, but for the majority, what else can we do? And that I think is an interesting but difficult one to resolve.
Thank you. I wish I had picked up on this other question earlier. Sorry to take you back to data just for a second.
That's okay.
What are your views on data-driven intervention classes, such as extra English or maths?
I think in the what makes data work report, I forget the name of it. I should know really. One of the kind of suggestions that Becky Allen brought into it was work out what you can do in terms of your interventions and support, and then find out the quickest way of finding out that information. So there's a 2 or 3 paragraph section where she said, well, you could, as a middle leader or head teacher, go home over half term and analyse hundreds of data points from each student. And then eventually that gets boiled down to a list of 20 students who we think we're going to give extra maths tuition to. Or you could say, right, we actually have capacity for this much tuition in maths this year. We know that on average, predictably, some students are going to struggle. So we're going to ask the teachers who they think would most benefit from this. And so I thought that would be my steer. That seems to be a better way to tackle it because it's quicker.
Yeah, makes sense. Got an interesting one here. So what are your thoughts on categorizing pupils in the ocean kind of manner that you referred to at the beginning? But then that person says, do you think there are elements of learning styles resurfacing here? And in fact, regardless of fads in education, is this a need to categorize our learners something we can or want to ever move away from?
There's a lot in there, isn't there? So I think, yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we push back against learning styles because of all the nonsensical behavior around them and the fact that they're not a thing. And if they are a thing, they don't predict learning. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? I don't think as a teacher, it would help me to know the ocean traits in my students because they wouldn't be measured very reliably. But it might help me to be aware that different students are going to find the same lesson, they're going to respond to it differently. And I don't know about people watching, but that helps me not to jump to conclusions, particularly when it's about whether I'm any good or not. So the students who are quiet, who don't answer questions, who don't even give eye contact. I mean, there's some fantastic writing around introversion and being in a school, but I think it's worth looking into that. It's worth me being aware that there's more going on than just me. And the fact that a student's presenting in a particular way doesn't necessarily mean that I'm doing things badly or wrong, or that I should make them kind of jump around the room or behave in a particular way. But I think that would be an example of where a strand could become the next wave. It won't do because it's quite obscure. But if someone says, right, look, in a classroom, people have got different traits using ocean, so test it and make sure you're teaching them in relation to those things. That becomes the next solution that's going to fail, doesn't it? That's what happens, because the minute that I hear that, well, then schools around the country get told they have to do ocean. They interpret it differently. They enact it in different ways with different classes. And for a while, people are doing diametrically opposed things under the same name. And eventually, it takes longer than we think it should. We learn it's not working and we look for the next thing. So it's a bit of a rambling answer, but hopefully that helped.
No, but it's interesting, isn't it? And you even made me think about what's it like for practitioners at different stages of their career. So, you know, at the start, we tend to really focus on us, on ourselves. Yeah.
And I think that's the bit where I think I need to think a bit more. So those different responses to solutions, they haven't gone away either. So just such as my class isn't a single coherent entity, the staff body are not either. And there's actually a group of teachers that a couple of people have said I should mention who didn't make it into these are different ways of responding to miracles. And they're kind of the battle axes. The teachers have been around the block quite a lot, and they're often quite resistant to new ideas. They're really interesting as well, because sometimes they've reached the point of resignation despite not leaving the job, and that's difficult, there can be a barrier. But sometimes they're a block to the latest new MPQSL graduates project because they know this will come and go like anything else. And it's quite interesting to take that on board. And then the inverse of it is, I think, something that Neil Gilbride is really strong with, would be different people need different messages at different points. And if you're a new teacher, there's an extent to which just looking at the complexity is the wrong thing to do. You want to know what to do for the next hour to ensure the lesson goes okay. And so pitching the message to the person you're speaking to becomes really important.
Thank you. I mean, there's plenty of other things that I could have asked you about, but I think we're at the end here. Perhaps a very quick one. Someone's mentioned, you mentioned early on that students know a different 50% to each other at the start of the lesson. So
yes,
going back to not all, how can we make sure that we're doing the best for all of them with this in mind?
Well, I guess that's again where you've got the classroom as a compromise. So we're going to repeat things that some students know. I think what I'm trying to do more, so I'm on my 13 years into teaching, it's probably more, you forget, don't you, after a while? I think maybe it's 15. I don't do it all the time, but occasionally I'll try and stop and get a glimpse into the complexity of a particular lesson. So that might be stopping and saying, can you write down all the things you know about X? And Dan Borman, a science teacher at my place, asked a few of his teachers to do that. Just to say, before I teach you this new topic in biology, write down what you know. And that's not going to fix the problem. That if you do that, you're going to be confronted with a complex picture, but you might get one or two surprises that mean you can tweak what you're doing. And back to kind of that concept of teaching sometimes being about me, the thing I also try and do is, if I think, right, I've just seen that student do this thing or respond to this question, I think it's because of X. What I've started to do is write that down. And if I have a reasonable relationship with that student afterwards, ask them, like, I think that's why you did this. Can you tell me if that's the case or not, or just more open? So I think you can't fix complexity, but I think probably, certainly in my career kind of arc so far, I've been pushed to avoid or ignore it more than is helpful. You can go too far the other way as well, but I think a lot of us could kind of take stock from that.
That's a very good place to stop.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much, Ben. That was really, really interesting. So take care, have a good day. And everyone, we will be back tomorrow morning at the normal time of 11 a.m. And so we'll see you then. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.